Putin's forces close in on the Ukrainian capital, his critics both in the West and now from within Russia itself fear that his ambitions do not end there, eliciting comparisons to Adolf Hitler.
This is a unilateral decision of Putin, who basically gone full Hitler and started an invasion of a sovereign and independent country.
Dan, our own Jennifer Griffin said if you look into Putin's eyes, you see someone who has gone completely mad. I want to pull up this quote from The Economist. I shared it with our viewers yesterday, but I really want to underscore it. It said this: "Now that it is clear he craves war, the question is, where will he stop? In acting, he has set aside the everyday calculus of political risk and benefits. Instead, he's driven by the dangerous, delusional idea that he has an appointment with history." When a nuclear power, a leader, has potentially lost sight of cost-benefit analysis, how concerning is that to you?
Yeah, it's concerning. You know, I recall a conversation I had once with a Russian intelligence officer, and I asked him, "What is it about your neighbors?" And he, you have such horrifically bad relations. And he said to me, "Look, if you have a really nice house and my house isn't so great, I'm just going to go burn yours down." That's kind of the way Vladimir Putin looks at the world, and especially his neighbors. Any neighbor of his, including the Baltic states, and a functioning democracy with a thriving economy, that's a threat to Vladimir Putin. We've seen what he's done to his own protesters. He denies his own people basic civil liberties that folks enjoy in places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So while we continue to plan for fighting the war that we face today in Ukraine, we need to prepare for the war that we might have to fight in the Baltic states against Russia. Putin's risk calculus has changed. I absolutely agree with that. And whether he's gone so far as General Secretary Brezhnev, who launched that ill-fated invasion of Afghanistan, which put a few nails in the Soviet evil empire coffin, that's certainly quite possible. And even if it's not that likely that Putin would engage in military attack on a NATO member at this time, we've got to prepare for it, and we've got to make it clear to Putin that we will stand up for our NATO member allies. And we haven't done that the way that we should, as effectively as we should.
What a concerning prospect that is, Rebecca, that Dan brings up. The notion that he could attack a NATO country. I mean, you mentioned last segment, this could go beyond Ukraine. It's not just our experts here on this panel. It's Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He was asked, is it a possibility that Putin goes beyond Ukraine? And he said, sure, it is a possibility. I mean, if NATO countries attacked, Article 5 steps up, and we're essentially obligated to step in.
That's exactly right. And it's not even... You know, Vladimir Putin, I actually think that he is behaving rationally based on his own assumptions that he holds. It's a mistake for Americans to think that when other countries behave so egregiously and as these belligerents, that they're madmen. It's that they have a different set of national objectives. And we better understand, Vladimir Putin was very clear in his speeches about his intent. And unless he is made to stop, unless he is made to pay a price that he's not willing to pay for his gains, he will keep going. I'm afraid that maybe he won't intentionally strike a NATO country, that he won't seek to do it on purpose. But he very well could be by accident. He can stumble into a war because if he keeps moving through Ukraine all the way up to the border and takes the whole country, you're going to have 7 NATO countries exposed to Russia, right up against the Russian border. And then, so you can have an accidental warplane or a missile land into NATO territory in which those countries understandably respond. And now we've just stumbled into a very serious war with nuclear powers. One last point. The French foreign minister bravely responded to these veiled nuclear threats on the part of the Russian Federation by reminding the Russians that NATO is a nuclear alliance as well. Once again, an ally is showing greater courage in saying something like that, so brave and so true and so necessary at this time that we're not seeing from U.S. officials.
Lauren, that's an interesting prospect that Rebecca brings up. It's the other side of the argument, which is this, that Putin's been in power for 22 years. And, as The Economist even noted, after 22 years, even a dictator with an overdeveloped sense of his own destiny has a nose for survival and the ebb and flow of power, because people in his own country are going to rise up when economically they're hit with really hard conditions.
Yeah, and that hasn't happened yet, unfortunately, but it can. And when we talk about, Rebecca was just saying strong words from the French foreign minister. Yeah, we're a nuclear alliance as well. we can hit you. We haven't seen that as we have this military invasion in Ukraine. We haven't seen that response with these late and light economic sanctions. Because what the economic sanctions don't do is target the bread and butter of the Russian and European economy. I mean, Russia, 2/3 of their economy is oil, and these sanctions have not touched their oil, right? Because Putin made the gamble. Being a leader and having experience, he knew that all 27 European Union nations wouldn't get together and agree that they had to make the same targeted sanction. And he won. He was right. And the bread and butter of his economy, his oil is still flowing through Ukraine to the rest of Europe, and the Europeans need it because they don't have anything else, because it's cold and they got to fill up the gas tanks. So he made a couple of bets here that he shared with the world, Kayleigh. That's the thing. We heard his manifesto, his essay that he wrote over the summer. This is what he intended to do. Then we tried that strategy of let's declassify information so Putin would know that we knew what he was going to do, and he did it anyway. And we were spot on. And now we're still trying to figure out how to respond to stop him. And quite frankly, I'm not sure what we can do at this point.
And meanwhile, the people of Ukraine suffer, Leslie. Look at this, a moving scene. This is in Kyiv, where a woman cries, and she's singing the Ukrainian national anthem while sleeping away from broken glass at her apartment window that occurred just after a Russian strike. I've also seen video of Christian men and women, Ukrainians, in the subway singing songs about their faith. They're suffering, Leslie.
Oh, absolutely. War is hell, and this is exactly what we see. But this is exactly an example, I would agree with Jennifer Griffin, of why it looks as if Vladimir Putin has become unhinged. He has been in an emotional state and reacting emotionally since 2014. This has been brewing since 2014. And I don't think there's any stopping him because he doesn't care on a level of humanity that we all share when we see these images of these Ukrainian people. I would agree with Dan. He hates freedom. And I also believe that he either thinks it's 1975 or he wants to go back to 1975, no matter the cost. I would disagree. I think it was Rebecca earlier that said it would not be an intentional, strike on a NATO nation. I think all rules, go out the window with this guy at this point, because I do believe he has become completely unhinged. And to Lauren's point, I wouldn't say it's light to attack 80% and have sanctions against 80% of the financial institutions in Russia and attacking them on almost every level, mining and coal, not just the financial institutions, individual oligarchs, And then the first day alone, as I mentioned before, I reiterate that $39 billion just in day one, to the president's point. Let's see what happens a month from now. And of course, more sanctions, I believe, will be coming because we do have that bipartisan support. And I believe, and I'm a Democrat, we need to have an Iranian style sanction against Vladimir Putin. But I also said, I'm not sure that's going to deter a guy that either mentally really is, again, in 1975, or wants to bring us back there.
Well, it's still confounding to many. If you knew this invasion was happening, as the president told us exactly a week ago today, why wait to put in place sanctions until after it happens? It's a question I think a lot of people are asking.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.